On his 80th birthday, a man sat down to write a letter. He had not spoken about this for almost 60 years. He had carried it in silence through the decades, through another war that tore the country apart, through the births of children and grandchildren, through a lifetime of trying to forget. But on this night, Private John G. Burnett of Captain Abraham McClellan's company, 2nd Regiment, 2nd Brigade, Mounted Infantry, finally decided to tell the truth. He wrote to his children. He told them about the year 1838. He told them about the Cherokee people. He told them what he had been ordered to do. And then he wrote 6 words that would haunt American history. The cruelest work I ever knew. He was 20 years old when they gave him a rifle and pointed him toward a Cherokee farmhouse. He was 20 years old when they told them to march families out of their homes at bayonet point. He was 20 years old when he watched children die on the side of a frozen road, and he could do nothing because those were his orders. And he was 80 years old when he finally admitted that he had never stopped seeing their faces. This is a story that almost nobody tells. We talk about the Trail of Tears. We talk about Andrew Jackson. We talk about the Cherokee. But we almost never talk about the thousands of young American men who were handed weapons and told to do something they knew was wrong. Who were these soldiers? What did they see? What did they do? And what did it cost them? Not in medals or promotions, but in the thing you can never get back once you lose it: their conscience. This is video in our series on Jackson's America and the age of Indian removal, and this is the story of the men who carried out the removal and the shame that followed them to their graves. To understand the men who carried out Indian removal, you first have to understand something that most Americans don't realize about the United States Army in the 1830s. It was tiny. In 1830, the entire regular United States Army numbered fewer than 6,000 men. That is not a typo. 6,000 soldiers to cover every fort, every border, every coastline, and every frontier of a nation that stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and beyond. For comparison, the city of New York alone had more than 200,000 people. The Army could barely fill a modern football stadium. These were not wealthy men. They were not the sons of planters or politicians. The typical enlisted soldier in the 1830s was poor, often an immigrant, frequently Irish or German, and almost always from the lowest rungs of American society. Pay was $5 a month. Housing was cramped, uncomfortable, and often squalid. Rations were salt pork, hardtack, and whatever you could hunt. Discipline was harsh. Flogging was still in use in some commands, and the enlistment was 5 years. These men signed up because they had no other options. Some were fleeing poverty in Europe, some were escaping debts. Some were looking for adventure and found only boredom and dysentery. They were not ideologues. They were not crusaders. They were working men in uniform, doing a job they rarely understood and almost never chose. The officers were different. Many were graduates of the United States Military Academy at West Point. They were educated, ambitious, and acutely aware that their careers depended on following orders, whether they agreed with those orders or not. Some of these officers had grown up near Native communities. Some had fought alongside Native allies in earlier wars. Some had genuine respect for the people they were about to destroy. And then there was the third group, the state militia volunteers. When the regular army wasn't large enough for a particular mission, and it almost never was, the government called on volunteers from the states. In the case of Cherokee removal, many of these volunteers came from Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. Some of them had a very specific motivation for signing up. They wanted Cherokee land. So when General Winfield Scott was given command of the Cherokee removal operation in the spring of 1838, he was leading a force that was divided against itself before it ever marched. Regulars who considered removal distasteful. Volunteers who considered it a land grab they could personally profit from. Officers who knew the operation was morally indefensible, but whose careers depended on obedience. And underneath all of it, the quiet knowledge that what they were about to do had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, and the president simply didn't care. 7,000 soldiers. That was the force assembled to remove 16,000 Cherokee from their homes. And the first thing General Scott did was something remarkable. He tried to make it humane. Winfield Scott was one of the most accomplished military officers in American history. He had served with distinction in the War of 1812. He would go on to plan the campaign that won the Mexican-American War. He was brilliant, vain, meticulous, and earned the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers for his obsessive attention to protocol and appearance. He was also, by the standards of his time, a man with a conscience. On May 10, 1838, Scott issued his address to the Cherokee people. It is one of the strangest documents in American military history. He was telling them they had to leave their homes, but he was also, in his own way, trying to preserve their dignity in a process designed to strip them of it. And then, on May 17th, he issued his orders to the troops. Listen to what he actually wrote. He told his soldiers that the Cherokee were to be treated with every possible kindness. He instructed them to allow families time to gather their belongings. He ordered that no Cherokee was to be subjected to unnecessary violence. He insisted that the sick and elderly be transported, not forced to walk. He demanded that families not be separated. He warned that any soldier who abused, robbed, or assaulted a Cherokee citizen would be subject to the harshest military punishment.
On paper, it was a model of compassion within the framework of a monstrous policy. On the ground, almost none of it was followed. The gap between Scott's orders and what actually happened is one of the most damning silences in American military history. Because the men receiving those orders were a mix of professionals and volunteers, operating in remote areas with little oversight, carrying out a mission that rewarded speed over care. And the Cherokee were not a theoretical policy problem. They were real people, living in real homes, on real land that white settlers were already claiming. The soldiers arrived at Cherokee farms in the early morning. That was the standard practice. Come early, before families could flee. Surround the property. Announce the order. You have to leave, now. Some accounts say families were given 30 minutes. Some say 15. Some say they were given no time at all. Dragged from breakfast tables, pulled from fields where they were working, rousted from beds where they were sleeping. The official orders said, allow time to gather belongings. The reality was that soldiers often gave families only the time it took to march them out the door. And as the families walked away from their homes, their white neighbors walked in. This was the part that haunted the soldiers more than almost anything else. They watched as settlers, people who had been waiting for exactly this moment, entered Cherokee homes before the families were even out of sight. They took furniture, they took livestock, they took tools and clothing and food. They dug up gardens. Some even began tearing apart homes for the lumber. The soldiers had orders to prevent looting. Many of them tried, but they were outnumbered by the settlers, and their primary mission was to move the Cherokee, not to protect their property. So they watched, and they remembered. Before the march west could begin, the Cherokee had to be gathered, and that meant stockades. Across Cherokee territory, the Army constructed temporary holding camps. They were surrounded by wooden palisades. They had no sanitation to speak of. They had minimal shelter, and they were designed to hold hundreds of people in spaces meant for dozens. By June of 1838, thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children were crowded into these stockade camps, waiting for enough people to be gathered to form a removal detachment, waiting for wagons that hadn't arrived, waiting for supplies that were inadequate when they did arrive, waiting in the heat of a
Disease hit almost immediately. Dysentery, whooping cough, measles. In conditions of extreme overcrowding, with contaminated water and insufficient food, illness spread through the camps like wildfire. Children were the most vulnerable. The elderly died quietly in corners, and the soldiers guarding these camps watched it happen. Some soldiers gave their own rations to starving Cherokee families. This is documented. Men who were already underfed themselves handed over their salt pork and hardtack to children who had nothing. Officers who reported the inadequate supply situation to their superiors were told that the contractors responsible for provisioning the camps were doing the best they could. The contractors were in fact doing the best they could to maximize profit.
Food meant for thousands was skimmed, replaced with spoiled goods, or simply never delivered. The corruption was staggering. The federal government had allocated money for the removal, money that was supposed to feed, clothe, and transport 16,000 people over 1,000 miles. Instead, much of that money went to contractors who delivered rotten meat, moldy flour, and blankets so thin they might as well have been paper. The soldiers saw this. The officers documented it. The complaints went nowhere. And the Cherokee, who only months before had been living in comfortable homes on prosperous farms, were now penned like animals, watching their children sicken and waiting for a march they knew would kill more of them. Hundreds died in the stockades before the march even began. Hundreds. And for every Cherokee who died, there was an American soldier standing outside the fence who would carry that image for the rest of his life. The main Cherokee removal began in the fall of 1838 and continued through the winter of 1839. The distance was approximately 1,000 miles, depending on the route. There were several routes, some overland, some partially by river. All of them were terrible. The Cherokee, to their credit, negotiated to manage portions of the removal themselves. Chief John Ross convinced General Scott to allow Cherokee leaders to organize the detachments and oversee the logistics. This probably saved thousands of lives, but it could not change the fundamental reality. 16,000 people were being forced to walk through one of the coldest winters on record with inadequate food, inadequate clothing, and inadequate shelter. The soldiers marched alongside them, and what those soldiers witnessed over the next 4 to 6 months broke something in many of them that never healed.
People died every day, not occasionally, not in unusual circumstances. Every single day of the march, people died. They died of cold. They died of pneumonia. They died of dysentery from contaminated water. They died of starvation when rations ran out, which happened constantly. They died of exhaustion, simply lying down on the side of the road and not getting up again. The elderly died first and in the greatest numbers, then the children, then the sick, then the people who had given their food or blankets to the elderly, the children, and the sick. Soldiers described watching mothers carry dead children for miles because there was no time to stop and bury them properly. They described elderly men walking barefoot through snow because they had no shoes, and there were no shoes to give them. They described crossing the Mississippi River in December, families loaded onto overcrowded ferries in freezing rain, waiting for days on the riverbank because there weren't enough boats. One of the most devastating accounts involves Chief John Ross's own wife, Quady Ross. During the march, she gave her blanket to a sick child. She contracted pneumonia. She died near Little Rock, Arkansas. The chief of the Cherokee Nation buried his wife on the side of a road in a territory that was not her home, surrounded by soldiers who were supposed to be her enemies, but who, by several accounts, wept at her funeral. Private John Burnett, the man we met at the beginning of this story, was there for all of it. He served as an interpreter because he spoke Cherokee, having learned the language from a Cherokee friend as a boy. That meant he was closer to the suffering than most soldiers. He heard the prayers. He heard the mothers singing to dying children. He heard the old men asking to be left behind to die in peace. And he was not alone. Across the multiple detachments of the removal, soldiers were watching the same things, and many of them were reaching the same conclusion. This is wrong. We are wrong. And we will pay for this. Not every soldier followed orders quietly. This is the part of the story that almost never gets told, and it matters. Because in the middle of one of the greatest injustices in American history, there were American soldiers who pushed back. Some pushed back quietly, officers who filed formal complaints about the conditions in the stockade camps. Officers who documented the corruption of the civilian contractors and sent those reports up the chain of command.
Officers who requisitioned additional supplies out of their own pocket or their own unit's budget, knowing they would never be reimbursed. These men understood the system. They worked within it, and the system absorbed their complaints and did nothing. Some pushed back more visibly. Soldiers who gave their own coats to Cherokee families during the winter march. Soldiers who shared their rations when they knew it meant going hungry themselves. soldiers who carried Cherokee children on their backs when the children could no longer walk. These were small acts. They did not change the policy. They did not stop the march. But they were acts of humanity in a situation designed to strip humanity away, and they deserve to be remembered. And some pushed back in ways that cost them. There are accounts of soldiers who requested transfers rather than continue participating in the removal. In the military of the 1830s, requesting a transfer was not a casual act. It was a statement. It went on your record. It could end your career. And some men did it anyway. There are accounts of officers who exceeded their authority to improve conditions for Cherokee detachments under their supervision. They slowed the march when people were too sick to continue, even when their orders said to maintain pace. They allowed longer rest periods. They looked the other way when Cherokee families slipped away into the woods. These officers were risking court-martial. Some were reprimanded. Some saw their promotions quietly disappear. The price of conscience was real and tangible. And then there are the stories that survived only as fragments. A soldier in North Georgia who hid a Cherokee family in his barn and told his commanding officer they had already been collected. A militiaman in Tennessee who simply walked away from his unit and went home, telling his family he would rather be called a deserter than participate in what was happening. A lieutenant who wrote a letter to a newspaper describing conditions in the Stockade camps, a letter that was published and caused a brief uproar before being forgotten. These men did not stop the trail of tears. They could not. But they proved that even within a system designed to suppress individual conscience, conscience survived. Not in everyone, not in most, but in enough to remind us that obedience is always a choice, even when it does not feel like one. Honesty requires us to say something uncomfortable here.
For every soldier who resisted, there were others who did not. For every act of quiet compassion, there were acts of casual cruelty. And for some men in uniform, particularly among the state militia volunteers, the removal was not a burden to be endured, but an opportunity to be seized. Volunteer militiamen from Georgia were, in many cases, the same men who had been squatting on Cherokee land before the removal began. They knew exactly which farms they wanted. They knew exactly which Cherokee families had the best livestock, the best tools, the best timber. Some of them signed up for militia service specifically to be present when those families were removed so they could claim the property immediately. These men did not treat the Cherokee with kindness. They treated them as obstacles to be moved, impediments to their own enrichment. Accounts from Cherokee survivors describe militia volunteers ransacking homes, striking people who moved too slowly, separating family members deliberately, and taunting people who were losing everything they had ever known. This was not universal among the volunteers, but it was common enough that General Scott himself issued additional orders specifically addressing the behavior of militia units, orders that were largely ineffective because the volunteers answered to their state governors, not to the regular Army chain of command. And then there was the vast middle, the majority of soldiers who were neither heroes nor villains, men who followed their orders, kept their heads down, did what they were told, and tried not to think too hard about what it meant. They were not cruel. They were not compassionate. They were compliant, and their compliance made the entire operation possible. This is the hardest truth about atrocity. It does not require that most people be evil. It only requires that most people do nothing. The march ended. The Cherokee arrived in Oklahoma, or what was then called Indian Territory. They buried their dead, tried to rebuild, and faced new horrors: factional violence, unfamiliar terrain, inadequate provisions, and the knowledge that their homeland was gone forever. The soldiers went home, and that is where a different kind of suffering began. We have a word for it now. We call it post-traumatic stress. We have therapists who treat it, medications that manage it, a cultural understanding that witnessing or participating in terrible things can wound you in ways that are invisible but devastating. In the 1830s, they had none of that. They had silence.
The soldiers who carried out the Cherokee removal and the Choctaw removal and the Creek removal and the Chickasaw removal and the Seminole Wars went home to families who did not ask what had happened, to communities that did not want to hear about it, and to a country that had already moved on to the next thing. There was no framework for understanding what they had experienced. There was no permission to grieve for people the nation had decided did not matter. There was only the expectation that you would put on your civilian clothes, pick up your plow or your tools, and be grateful you survived. Many of them could not do that. The historical record is fragmentary because men of this era did not write about their feelings in ways we would recognize today. But what survives is haunting. Letters that mention nightmares. Diary entries that trail off into incoherence when the subject of the Cherokee campaign comes up. Family stories passed down through generations about a grandfather who would not talk about his army service, who drank too much, who sometimes woke up screaming, who told his grandchildren once and only once that he had done something terrible when he was young and that God would never forgive him. These men carried their guilt without vocabulary, without treatment, without recognition. They aged with it. They died with it. And then there is John Burnett. Private Burnett's birthday letter, written in 1890, 52 years after the removal, is one of the most remarkable primary sources in American history. It is not a formal document. It is not a military report. It is a man talking to his children, telling them the truth about what he saw before it dies with him. He described the roundup, the families torn from their homes, the stockade camps, the disease, the march, the cold, the dead. He described it all with the clarity of a man who had been replaying these memories for more than half a century. He told his children that he had seen helpless Cherokee people arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at bayonet point into stockades. He told them about the suffering on the trail, about the grief and the hunger and the dying. He told them about the cruelty and about the kindness. He told them about a people who had done nothing wrong, who had built homes and farms and schools and churches, who had done everything the white man asked of them, and who were destroyed anyway.
And at the end, he wrote something that every American should read. He said that the removal of the Cherokee was the most brutal, most inhumane act he had ever witnessed. He said that the trail where they walked and the trail where they died would be remembered. He said that future generations would weep over the memory. He was right. We do weep. But for a very long time, we did not remember. There is a question buried in this story that we cannot avoid, and it is not a comfortable one. What do we owe the men who did terrible things while trying to be decent? The soldiers who carried out Indian removal were not, for the most part, monsters. They were young men in a system that told them obedience was the highest virtue. They were following orders issued by a democratically elected government, authorized by an act of Congress, signed by the president. They were operating within the legal and political framework of their nation, and what their nation asked them to do was participate in the ethnic cleansing of a sovereign people. Some of them resisted, most did not. And the ones who did not, the ones who simply followed orders, are they guilty or are they victims of a different kind? This is not a hypothetical question. It is the question that echoes through every military operation in history where soldiers were asked to harm civilians. It echoed at Nuremberg. It echoed at My Lai. It echoes today every time a young person in uniform is placed in a situation where the order and the conscience point in opposite directions. The soldiers of the Cherokee removal did not have the benefit of a Geneva Convention. They did not have international law defining crimes against humanity. They did not have a culture that accepted the idea of refusing an order on moral grounds. What they had was the quiet, terrible knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. And most of them did it anyway. That does not make them innocent. But it should make us ask a harder question. In their place, with their knowledge, under their pressures, with their limited options, what would we have done? The honest answer, for most of us, is that we would have done exactly what they did. We would have followed orders. We would have kept our heads down. We would have gone home and tried to forget. And that answer is the most terrifying part of this entire story.
Because it means that atrocity does not require evil people. It only requires ordinary people in a system that makes evil ordinary. Not all the soldiers stayed silent forever. In the decades after the removal, as these men aged and the urgency of career protection faded, some began to speak. Not many, but enough to create a record. Burnett was the most famous, but he was not alone. Other veterans of the removal wrote letters, gave interviews, and told their stories to local newspapers as they entered their final years. The pattern is remarkably consistent. They waited until they were old. They waited until the men who gave them their orders were dead. They waited until they had nothing left to lose. And then they spoke. What they said was almost always the same. They described it as the worst experience of their lives. They described it as a crime. And they described it as something they wished they had refused to participate in. Some of these veterans went further. A small number became active advocates for the rights of Native Americans in the post-Civil War era. They testified before congressional committees, they wrote to newspapers, they used the credibility of their military service to argue that what the government had done to the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek and the Chickasaw and the Seminole was not just wrong in hindsight. It was wrong when it happened. And they knew it was wrong when it happened because they were there and they saw the faces. These men are almost entirely forgotten. Their names do not appear in history textbooks. Their testimonies are buried in local archives and family collections. They are footnotes in a story that itself is barely taught. But they matter. They matter because they prove that knowing something is wrong and saying something is wrong are two very different things. And they matter because, in the end, they chose to say it, even when it was decades too late to change anything. The question is, too late for whom? Too late for the Cherokee who died on the trail, certainly. Too late to undo the crime, absolutely. But not too late for the historical record. Not too late for us. Because those testimonies are how we know what happened. Not from the general's reports, which were sanitized, not from the politicians' speeches, which were self-serving, not from the newspapers of the day, which were largely indifferent. We know what the Trail of Tears looked like from the ground because old soldiers, finally freed from the prison of their silence, told the truth.
Private John Burnett finished his birthday letter on December 11th, 1890. He sealed it, he gave it to his children, and then, presumably, he went to sleep. We do not know if he slept well that night. We do not know if telling the truth, finally, after 52 years, gave him any peace. We know only that he felt compelled to speak, and that when he did, the words came with a force that suggests they had been pressing against his silence for a very long time. He died in 1905. He was 95 years old. He had outlived almost everyone else who had been there. The soldiers, the Cherokee, the politicians who ordered it, the contractors who profited from it, the settlers who stole the land. He was one of the last living witnesses to one of the great crimes of American history, and his letter survived. That matters more than we might realize, because the story of Indian removal is not just the story of the Cherokee, or the Choctaw, or the Seminole, or the Creek, or the Chickasaw. It is also the story of the nation that did this to them. It is the story of the politicians who voted for it, and the president who signed it, and the citizens who allowed it, and the soldiers who carried it out. It is all of our story. And the soldiers, the young, underpaid, poorly trained, morally conflicted, sometimes brave and sometimes cowardly men who held the bayonets, they are the part of the story we most need to hear, because they force us to confront the most uncomfortable truth about atrocity. It is not committed by aliens. It is not committed by a separate species of monster. It is committed by people like us, following orders that came from people like us, in a system built by people like us. The soldiers who were ashamed deserve to be remembered, not because their shame absolves them, it does not, but because their shame proves they were human. And if they were human, then what they did is a human problem, our problem. The ones who spoke up too late are still more honest than the ones who never spoke at all. And the ones who resisted, even in small ways, even when it cost them, the officer who slowed the march, the private who gave his coat, the man who hid the family in his barn, they are proof that conscience is never entirely extinguished. Even in the worst circumstances, some people choose to be decent. Not enough people, never enough, but some. And that is the thread that connects this story to everything that comes next.
The soldiers who carried out removal lived in an era that had a word for what they were doing. They called it progress. They called it civilization. They called it destiny. They had an entire ideology that told them that what was happening to Native Americans was not a tragedy, but an inevitability. That the expansion of the United States across the continent was not a policy choice, but a mandate from God himself. That ideology has a name, and understanding it is the key to understanding not just what happened to the Cherokee or the Seminole, but what happened next, to Mexico, to the West, and ultimately to a nation that would tear itself apart over the question of whether one human being could own another. In the next and final video of this series, we tell the story of the idea that justified everything: manifest destiny.